She had been sitting there for 2 hours. The cappuccino in front of her had gone cold an hour ago. Outside, Christmas lights blinked red and gold through the frosted windows. Inside, just silence and stares. The wait staff had stopped being subtle about it. A woman in a designer coat, sitting alone on Christmas Eve. They whispered. They pitied her. One barista even offered her a free refill with soft, sympathetic eyes. But Joanna Sterling didn't leave. At 9:43 p.m., the door finally opened. He walked in, out of breath, wrinkled shirt, hair a mess, like he'd thrown on whatever was closest, and ran out the door. In his hands, a small wrapped gift and a bunch of red roses that looked slightly crushed. A man who looked nothing like someone a billionaire should be waiting for. But she didn't stand up to leave. She stayed right where she was. Because the most expensive thing in that cafe wasn't a $3,000 coat. It was the 2 hours she just spent waiting. Joanna Sterling had built her empire on one rule: time is money. In her world, you closed deals in 10 minutes or you walked away. Patience wasn't a virtue. It was a weakness. Yet here she was. Williams apologized the moment he reached her table. His voice cracked with nervousness and exhaustion. He explained that he'd been stuck at work, that there was an emergency double shift, that the night janitor didn't show up and management needed someone to cover. He couldn't say no because he needed the money, because Christmas was expensive and his daughter Lisa had been asking for a specific doll she'd seen in a store window. Joanna listened without interrupting. She noted the coffee stain on his sleeve, the wrinkled jacket that looked like it had been pulled from the bottom of a laundry basket, the scuffed shoes. Everything about his appearance said he'd rushed out the door without thinking about how he looked. And yet, he'd stopped to buy roses. Cheap roses from a corner store, with petals already fallen off, but roses nonetheless. When he finished apologizing, Joanna told him to sit down. Williams looked surprised, like he'd expected her to storm out or slap him, or at least say something cutting. But she just repeated herself calmly and gestured to the seat across from her. He sat slowly, carefully placing the roses on the table between them. He said they were for her, that he knew they weren't much, that he'd gotten them from the corner store. Joanna touched one of the soft red petals and told him they were lovely. She couldn't remember the last time someone had actually bought her flowers themselves instead of having an assistant order an expensive arrangement. Williams explained that he was a janitor at an office building downtown. He said it wasn't glamorous work, and it didn't really pay all the bills, but it was honest. He laughed bitterly when he said that last part, like he knew how it sounded to someone like her. And that's when Joanna understood why Margaret had set this up as a blind date, instead of just showing her a photo or telling her more detail beforehand. Because if Joanna had known who Williams really was, a janitor, a single father barely making ends meet, she never would have agreed to come. Margaret knew that. Margaret, her college roommate who'd stayed grounded while Joanna built her empire, had decided Joanna needed a lesson. The funny thing was, Joanna didn't feel disappointed. She felt curious. She asked about his daughter. William's entire demeanor changed when he talked about Lisa. His face softened, his shoulders relaxed, and for a moment the exhaustion seemed to lift. He said Lisa was 7 years old, and the reason he couldn't turn down extra shifts. He mentioned the heating that broke in their apartment, right when he'd finally saved enough of that doll Lisa wanted. He started to explain his financial struggles, but then stopped himself abruptly, saying Joanna hadn't come there to listen to his problems. Joanna asked him what Margaret had told him about her. Williams said Margaret mentioned she was successful, that she worked in finance or something similar. Joanna corrected him. She said she was a venture capitalist who bought companies, fixed them, and sold them for profit. She told him she was worth about $800 million. The color drained from William's face. He went completely still, and Joanna could see him processing what that meant. the enormous gap between their worlds becoming impossible to ignore. She explained that Margaret hadn't set them up because they were compatible. Margaret had set it up because she thought Joanna needed to be humbled or taught a lesson. Joanna told him about her ex-fiancé, about the cutting remark he'd made before they broke up, that she only invested in things that gave immediate returns, that she couldn't wait for anything to grow. Williams asked if that was why she'd stayed in the cafe for 2 hours, to prove her ex-fiancé wrong. Joanna said she didn't know. Maybe that was part of it. Or maybe she was just tired of always walking away from anything that wasn't immediately profitable or perfect. William started to say something about how they both knew how this would end, that she'd go back to her world, and he'd go back to his, because that's just how these things worked. But before he could finish, his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, and his expression changed immediately to worry. It was a message from Lisa. She was staying with their neighbor, Mrs. Chun, but there was something Williams had promised to do that night, and he'd completely forgotten about it in the chaos of his shift. He stood up quickly, grabbing the small wrapped gift he'd brought. He said he had to go. Joanna asked what he'd promised Lisa. Williams explained it was a Christmas tradition they had, something that probably sounded stupid to an outsider. Every Christmas Eve at exactly 10 o'clock, they hung a specific ornament on their tree, a little silver star. His late wife, Sarah, had started the tradition when Lisa was 3, and after Sarah died in a car accident 3 years ago, Lisa had made Williams promise they'd keep doing it at the exact same time every year. He looked at his phone again. It was already past 10. He said he'd ruined everything that night. The date, the promise to his daughter, all of it. That's when Joanna surprised herself. She stood up and told Williams she wanted to come with him. She wanted to help with the ornament, with whatever he needed. Williams stared at her like she'd lost her mind. He asked if she was serious. Joanna said she'd waited 2 hours and didn't want it to be a waste. Williams looked at her for a long moment, trying to figure out if she meant it or if this was some kind of rich person's game. Because he finally nodded and said okay. They took the bus, because Williams didn't have a car, and Joanna's driver would have taken too long to arrive. The bus smelled like wet winter coats and cheap pine air freshener. Christmas music played faintly from someone's phone somewhere in the back. Joanna sat by the window in her $3,000 designer coat and her impractical heels, watching the city change as they traveled further from the downtown core she knew. William sat beside her, checking his phone obsessively. The wrapped gift balanced on his lap. His leg bounced with nervous energy. When Joanna told him they'd make it in time, he said it was already 9:58, and they were still 10 minutes away from his apartment. She told him they'd just be a little late then. But Williams explained that she didn't understand. This wasn't just any tradition. His wife, Sarah, had been a nurse, working long shifts just like he did now. She'd started the ornament tradition as a way to guarantee that no matter how chaotic their schedules got, they have this one moment together as a family. Exactly 10 o'clock on Christmas Eve. The same silver star ornament. Every single year. After Sarah died, hit by a drunk driver while coming home from her nursing shift, Lisa was only 4 years old. William said some days he thought Lisa barely remembered what her mother's face looked like. But she remembered that ornament. She remembered the exact time. It was the one piece of her mother she could hold on to. Joanna felt something tighten in her chest. She asked how long ago Sarah had passed. William said 3 years, and his voice went quiet in a way that said the grief was still fresh, still sitting heavy on him every single day. The bus lurched and stopped to pick up more passengers. A teenager across the aisle kept staring at Joanna, like she was a museum exhibit that had somehow wandered onto public transportation. Joanna became acutely aware of how out of place she was. Her designer coat, her expensive jewelry, her perfectly styled hair. Everything about her screamed wealth in a space where most people were clearly counting their change to afford the bus fare. Williams said she could still leave. He offered to get off at the next stop and call her a cab. He said she didn't have to pretend this was normal for her, riding buses, going to small apartments in neighborhoods she'd probably never heard of, helping a stranger with his daughter's Christmas tradition. Joanna told him he was right. None of this was normal for her. But then she explained what her normal actually looked like. She spent every day in boardrooms making decisions that affected thousands of people she'd never meet. She moved money around like it was a game with points and scores. She closed deals worth millions before lunch. And at the end of every day, she went home to an empty penthouse and ate expensive takeout alone. William said that sounded lonely. Joanna agreed that it was. The bus turned onto narrower streets. The buildings here were older, shorter, small businesses with hand-painted signs, Christmas decorations that looked homemade strung between windows. The bus stopped again, and William stood up, saying this was their stop. Outside, the cold hit immediately. William shrugged off his wrinkled jacket and offered it to Joanna. When she protested, he insisted, saying her designer coat was made for looking expensive, not for keeping warm. She took the jacket. It smelled like laundry detergent and something else she couldn't quite place, something that reminded her of a simpler time, before her family had money, when her father worked 2 jobs and her mother clipped coupons. They walked quickly through the icy streets. Joanna struggled to keep up in her heels. They reached a brick building with a faded red door. Williams pulled out his keys but paused before unlocking it. He warned Joanna that his apartment was small, really small. There would be dishes in the sink and toys everywhere. He clearly didn't want her to judge him for it. Joanna told him she didn't care about any of that. William studied her face like he was trying to determine if she was telling the truth. Then he unlocked the door, and they climbed 3 flights of stairs, Williams taking them 2 at a time, because it was now 10:04, and he was late for the promise he'd made to his daughter. When they reached apartment 3C, the door opened before Williams could use his key. A little girl stood there in snowflake pajamas, holding the silver star ornament. She had William's eyes and a gap-toothed smile. She called out that her daddy was late, but that Mrs. Chun had said he'd come, and he had, and he'd brought someone with him. Williams dropped to one knee and started apologizing, but Lisa threw her arms around his neck and said it was okay. He was there now, and that's what mattered. Then she looked at Joanna with open, innocent curiosity and asked if she was her daddy's friend. An elderly woman emerged from the apartment next door. Mrs. Chun, the neighbor who'd been watching Lisa. She smiled at Joanna, wished them all a Merry Christmas, and headed back into her own apartment. Inside William's apartment, Joanna saw exactly what he described. The place was tiny, a living room barely big enough for a worn couch, a kitchen area where dishes did sit in the sink, a small hallway that probably led to 1 or 2 bedrooms. But there was a Christmas tree in the corner, small and slightly crooked, covered in homemade ornaments and lights that blinked unevenly. The apartment was warm, though not just from the heating system that clanked somewhere in the walls, but warm in a way Joanna's penthouse had never been. There were photos on the walls, Williams and Lisa at a park, Lisa's school drawings held up in magnets on the refrigerator, a blanket draped over the couch that looked hand-knitted. This was a home where people actually lived, where they made memories and felt things and cared about each other. Lisa held out the silver star ornament to Joanna and said she should be the one to hang it since she'd come all this way. Williams looked surprised but nodded when Joanna glanced at him for permission. Lisa explained very seriously that the ornament went on the top branch on the left side of the tree because that's where Mommy had always put it. Joanna took the delicate ornament carefully. It was light, probably bought at a discount store years ago, not real silver at all. But Lisa looked at it like it was the most precious thing in the world, like it was made of stardust and wishes. Joanna reached up and hung the star on the branch Lisa had indicated. It was 10:09 on Christmas Eve, 9 minutes late. But as Joanna looked at Lisa's beaming face and William's grateful smile, she realized that maybe some things were worth waiting for. After Lisa hung the ornament, she insisted that Joanna see her room. Williams tried to tell his daughter that Joanna probably needed to get home, but Joanna said she'd love to see Lisa's room. The little girl grabbed her hand and pulled her down the narrow hallway. Lisa's bedroom was tiny, barely big enough for a twin bed and a small dresser. But the walls were covered in drawings, some clearly done by Lisa herself, others that looked like they'd been drawn by someone with more skill, probably her mother. There were stars and flowers and stick figure families. On the dresser sat a framed photo of a woman with kind eyes and Lisa's smile. Sarah. Lisa talked rapidly, showing Joanna her stuffed animals and her books and the doll she'd gotten for her last birthday. She asked Joanna questions, too. Where did she live? Did she have any kids? Did she like Christmas? Joanna answered honestly. She lived downtown, in a tall building. She didn't have children. She used to like Christmas when she was young, but it had been a long time since she'd really celebrated it. Lisa found this deeply concerning. She asked how someone could not celebrate Christmas. Joanna tried to explain that when you got older and busier, sometimes holidays felt like just another day. But Lisa shook her head firmly and said that Christmas was never just another day. It was the most important day because it was about family and love and being together. Out of the mouths of babes, Joanna thought. This 7-year-old had just summarized everything Joanna had forgotten while building her empire. Williams appeared in the doorway and told Lisa it was time for bed. Lisa protested that it was Christmas Eve and she should be allowed to stay up late. Williams said the sooner she went to sleep, the sooner Christmas morning would arrive. Lisa considered this logic and decided it was sound. But before she got into bed, Lisa asked Joanna if she'd come back for Christmas. Not just Christmas morning, but for Christmas itself. For the whole day. Joanna looked at Williams, not sure how to answer. Williams looked just as uncertain. Lisa didn't wait for an answer. She just said she hoped Joanna would come because it would be nice to have someone else there besides just her and her daddy. Then she climbed into bed and Williams tucked her in, kissing her forehead and telling her he loved her. Joanna and Williams left the room, pulling the door partly closed but leaving it open enough that a slice of hallway light fell across Lisa's bed. They walked back to the living room and stood there for a moment in awkward silence. Williams finally spoke. He apologized for Lisa putting Joanna on the spot like that. He said his daughter had been asking for a long time when he was going to find someone special, and she probably got overexcited seeing him with a woman. He assured Joanna that she didn't need to feel obligated to come back. He understood this had just been one evening, one strange evening at that. But Joanna surprised herself again. She asked Williams why he'd really agreed to the blind date. He seemed confused by the question. She clarified. Margaret must have told him something about her, about who she was and what she was worth. He could have said no. He could have decided a billionaire venture capitalist was way out of his league and not worth the embarrassment. So why had he said yes? Williams was quiet for a long moment. Then he admitted that he'd been lonely, that raising Lisa alone was the most important thing in his world, but it was also isolating, that he hadn't been on a date in 3 years because he was always working or taking care of his daughter, and the few women he'd met through friends had lost interest the moment they understood his situation. Single dad, low income, no prospects for dramatic improvement. Margaret had promised him that her friend was different, that she was successful but also kind, and that she might understand what it was like to be lonely even when your life looked full from the outside. Joanna felt something crack open in her chest. She told Williams that her ex-fiancé had been right about her. She did only invest in things that gave immediate returns. She had spent 15 years building her wealth, and in the process, she'd forgotten how to invest in anything that couldn't be measured on a spreadsheet. She'd lost friends because she was always working. She'd lost relationships because she couldn't commit to anything that required patience or vulnerability. She'd lost herself somewhere along the way. Williams asked what changed. Why was she here in this tiny apartment instead of in her penthouse or at some fancy Christmas Eve party with other billionaires? Joanna said she didn't know exactly. Maybe it was her ex-fiancé's words finally sinking in. Maybe it was turning 40 and realizing she'd built an empire but had no one to share it with. Maybe it was seeing Williams walk into that cafe 2 hours late, disheveled and apologetic, carrying cheap roses and a gift he'd probably spent more than he could afford on. Seeing that and realizing it was the most genuine thing anyone had done for her in years. She told Williams about her typical Christmas. She'd go to her office and work, because the markets in Asia were still open. She'd order expensive food that she'd eat alone while reviewing quarterly reports. She'd maybe video call her parents, who'd retired to Florida and spent their Christmases on a golf course. She'd go to bed early because there was no reason to stay up late. And on Christmas morning, she'd wake up and do it all over again because holidays were just days, and days were for productivity. Williams listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said that sounded like the loneliest thing he'd ever heard. Joanna laughed, but it came out bitter. She said it was pathetic, wasn't it? A billionaire who couldn't buy the one thing she actually needed, connection. But Williams shook his head. He said it wasn't pathetic. It was just sad. And he understood it better than she might think, because his loneliness came from a different place but felt just as heavy. He had Lisa, and he loved her more than anything. But sometimes late at night, after she was asleep, he'd sit in this living room and feel the weight of everything he was doing alone. Every decision, every worry, every moment of joy, all experienced with no one to share it with. That's when Joanna made a decision. She asked Williams if his offer still stood, if Lisa's invitation to come back for Christmas was genuine. Williams said of course it was, but he didn't want Joanna to feel pressured. Joanna said she didn't feel pressured. She felt something else entirely. She felt like maybe, for the first time in 15 years, she was about to invest in something that would actually matter. Williams asked what she meant. Joanna said she wanted to come back for Christmas, not as a guest, not as some billionaire doing charity work. She wanted to come back as someone who was part of this, part of whatever this small, imperfect family was building. Williams looked at her with a mixture of hope and fear. He said he had to be honest with her. His life wasn't going to change overnight. He was still going to be a janitor barely making ends meet. His apartment was still going to be tiny. He was still going to struggle with bills and worry about giving Lisa everything she deserved, getting involved with him meant stepping into all of that mess. Joanna told him she understood, and then she said something that surprised even herself. She said that for 15 years she'd been chasing clean investments, companies with clear profit margins, deals with guaranteed returns, relationships that looked perfect on paper, and all of it had left her empty. Maybe what she needed wasn't another clean investment. Maybe what she needed was the mess. Joanna left Williams' apartment building around midnight. She called her driver to pick her up, and as she waited on the cold street corner, she thought about what she'd just agreed to, coming back for Christmas, stepping into a life that was completely different from her own, investing in people instead of companies. It was terrifying. The drive back to her penthouse took 20 minutes. Her driver asked if she'd had a good evening, and Joanna realized she didn't know how to answer that. It had been one of the strangest evenings of her life, but it had also been one of the most real. That night, Joanna barely slept. She kept thinking about Lisa's smile, about William's exhausted eyes, about the tiny apartment that felt more like home than her multi-million-dollar penthouse ever had. She thought about the silver star ornament and how something so simple and inexpensive had meant everything to a little girl who'd lost her mother. At 6 a.m. on Christmas Day, Joanna got up and did something she hadn't done in years. She didn't check her emails. She didn't review reports. She didn't turn on her computer at all. Instead, She went to her closet and found the most casual clothes she owned, jeans she bought years ago but never wore, a simple sweater. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. No designer labels. No jewelry except simple earrings. No armor. She called her driver and gave him William's address. On the way, she stopped at a store that was open early for last-minute Christmas shoppers. She bought ingredients for Christmas breakfast: eggs, bacon, fresh bread, orange juice, coffee. She bought wrap presents too. A doll for Lisa, the one Williams had mentioned, the one from the store window. A warm winter coat for Williams because his jacket had been so thin. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that screamed billionaire trying to buy affection. Just practical things they needed. When she arrived at Williams' building at 8 in the morning, she stood outside for a moment, nervous in a way she hadn't been nervous in years. What if she'd misread everything? What if Williams regretted inviting her? What if Lisa didn't actually want her there? But then she climbed those 3 flights of stairs and knocked on apartment 3C, and when Williams opened the door, still in his pajamas with his hair sticking up, looking shocked to see her, she knew she'd made the right choice. Williams asked what she was doing there so early. Joanna held up the grocery bags and said she'd come to make breakfast. Williams stared at her like she'd just said she could fly. Lisa appeared behind her father, still in her snowflake pajamas. When she saw Joanna, she let out a squeal of delight and ran forward, wrapping her arms around Joanna's waist. She said she knew Joanna would come back. She just knew it. Williams let Joanna inside. The apartment looked exactly the same as it had the night before, except now there were a few wrapped presents under the small tree, probably things Williams had bought for Lisa with the money from his double shift. Joanna set down the grocery bags and added her presents to the pile. Lisa immediately wanted to open everything, but Williams said they had to have breakfast first. That was the rule. Breakfast, then presents. So Joanna cooked. It had been years since she'd actually cooked anything. She had chefs. She had personal assistants who arranged meals. She had restaurants on speed dial. But she'd grown up cooking with her mother before her family had money. And it turned out she still remembered how. Williams tried to help, but Joanna waved him away and told him to sit with his daughter. She wanted to do this. She wanted to be useful in a way that had nothing to do with moving money or closing deals. They ate breakfast together at William's small kitchen table. Lisa talked nonstop about what she hoped was in the wrapped presents under the tree. Williams was quieter, watching Joanna like he was trying to figure out if she was real or if he dreamed the entire previous night. After breakfast, they opened presents. Lisa opened hers first. She tore into the wrapping paper with the pure joy that only children can muster. When she saw the doll, the specific doll from the store window, she screamed with happiness. She asked her daddy how he'd known, how he'd gotten it. Williams looked confused and said he hadn't bought that. Lisa turned to Joanna, and Joanna admitted she'd picked it up that morning. Lisa launched herself at Joanna, hugging her so tight that Joanna felt tears prick her eyes. When was the last time someone had hugged her like that? Like she'd just given them the world? Williams opened his present next. The warm winter coat. He ran his hand over the fabric. Good quality, but not ostentatious. He said it was too much. Joanna said it absolutely wasn't, especially considering how thin his current jacket was. He needed something that would actually keep him warm during those late-night shifts. Williams looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he said he had something for her, too. He pulled out the small wrapped gift he'd been carrying the night before at the cafe. He handed it to Joanna and said it wasn't much, and he'd bought it before he knew who she really was. So she'd have to excuse how small it was compared to what she was used to. Joanna unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small snow globe with a winter scene, a family of 3 standing in front of a Christmas tree. She shook it gently and watched the white flakes swirl around the tiny figures. William said he'd seen it at a store and thought about how Christmas should be about family, about being together. He'd bought it weeks ago when Margaret first told him about the blind date, thinking that maybe this year he'd get to have someone to share Christmas with besides just Lisa. Joanna felt tears actually fall then, sliding down her cheeks before she could stop them. Lisa asked why she was crying. Joanna said she wasn't sad. She was the opposite of sad. She couldn't remember the word for it, and Lisa helpfully supplied, happy. Yes, Joanna said. She was happy. They spent the rest of Christmas Day in that tiny apartment. They watched Christmas movies on William's old television. They played board games that Lisa picked out. They made lunch together and dinner too. Williams told stories about Lisa's mother, and Lisa showed Joanna more of her drawings and her favorite books.